right, to get started, we're going to stand up so we can get focused and calm down from the long day we've all had. We're going to stand up. Everybody up. Hands overhead. Mini back bend. And back down to namaste. And we're centered and ready to learn. Yes? Ready?
Yes.
Okay. So, today marks the first day of our journey with the French Revolution. And we'll be covering the French Revolution through the characters of Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. Who in here has watched a movie or read an article about the French Revolution? Anyone? And what was that? Sarah?
Les Mis.
Les Mis?
It is Marie Antoinette.
All right, all right. Well, chances are that these movies and articles or books have been inspired by Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. Dickens did a great job of actually giving a face to the Revolution, which was a pivotal point in history. So we'll first start with how Dickens describes this time in history. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epic of belief. It was the epic of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. So to understand where our story takes place, it's very important that we understand the time that our plot unfolds. So today we're going to be focusing on one year in particular, and that was 1789. And 1789 was kind of the tipping point of the revolution. History had built up to this point, and it was about to crumble in France. So we'll start with the Age of Enlightenment. Up to 1789, a movement was starting to take place called the Age of Enlightenment. And French philosophers like Rousseau and Voltaire started to kind of think of the idea that why are we basing our monarchy on this God-given right? And shouldn't our equality and justice be based off of truth and reason, or should it be based off of a God-given right? So who in here had Age of Enlightenment for their homework?
I did.
Okay, tell me a little bit about the Age of Enlightenment and how it was taking place in France during this time.
All right. Well, like you said, it was a cultural movement in the 17th and 18th century, which began in Europe and later changed to America. The purpose was to reform society using reason to challenge
Right.
ideas, tradition, faith, and scientific method. Major players, again, John Locke, Voltaire, Isaac Newton, and kind of the ideas that were born in this age were, again, scientific thought, skepticism, intellectual interchange, intolerance and abuses by the church and state. And this all had a major impact on culture, politics,
And how did the monarchy view this movement?
They probably didn't like it.
Okay, and why did they not like it?
Their subjects were rising against them and starting to believe things that they weren't teaching them.
And how did the nobility and the monarchy, where did they think their rights came from?
God.
From God. And what did the Age of Enlightenment challenge?
And so the thoughts and ideas came from man.
Precisely. So we see this happening. And also the American Revolution is taking place. And it's important to note that France was very important in the American Revolution. They were an ally to America. So at the same time, the 7 Years' War is coming to an end. And who had the 7 Years' War? All right, Kelsey. Keep on going. What's the 7 Years' War?
Okay, it was a war that took place between Great Britain and the Bourbon dynasty, which resulted in overlapping interests in their colonial and trade empires.
Okay.
It involved Great Britain, but it also affected the entirety of Europe, North America, Central America, Western Africa, India, and the Philippines.
now, as a result of being at war for 7 years, what was the economic climate like because of that?
It drained everybody's treasury. They couldn't trade. They couldn't make money at all.
All right. So again, we're seeing this movement, this Age of Enlightenment, and at the same time, France is broke. There's a terrible famine that swept the country. The price of bread increased by 50% in 1 year. And at the same time, the wages were not going up. So we have a financial crisis, we have the Age of Enlightenment, and then we have lovely King Louis and his wife Marie Antoinette. And somebody tell me about how they lived their lives.
I have that one, and they lived very extravagantly.
Okay, now tell me about King Louis, what his reign was like, what his ideals were, how he saw himself.
Well, he was a little timid. He didn't know really how to rule a country. He followed the advice of one man, I can't remember his name, and that man actually persuaded him to join the American Revolution, which led to the French Revolution.
Okay, and tell me about his wife, Marie Antoinette. What was she like and how was she perceived in the public?
She was Austrian, and the people didn't like that. She was a foreigner. They thought she spent a lot of money. She was the queen of excess. The whole "let them eat cake" quote.
Okay, and it's important to note that "let them eat cake" never happened. She never said that. So I think, the people are desperate. They don't have any food. They're broke. And that's just the kind of thing that will really make somebody mad. They're hungry and they see their king and queen living this life of luxury. So, the Age of Enlightenment, they're starting to think, well, maybe these people don't have a right to rule us after all. Maybe their rights aren't God-given. The country's broke. The people are hungry. So King Louis is kind of starting to panic. Like he doesn't know, like you said, he was very timid. And he took the advice to call this meeting of the Estates General, which included the first, second, and third estates. The first estate were the clergy, the men of God. The second estate were the nobility. And the third estate was everybody else, which just happened to be 98% of the population. So, at the urgence of the third estate, they for the first time met as a general assembly. They all met together. And so the first and second estates both had about 300 members. And so the third estate, had about 600. So they kind of had the majority. So people were kind of starting to get nervous that this third estate may have some pull in this parliament. So who had the meeting of the Estates General? Who can tell me what happened? What was the outcome of that?
So, like you were saying, the common people were pretty upset. The reason they were upset was the clergy and the nobles said that they had to vote based on the old way, which
Right.
was 200 years ago. So they couldn't vote per head. They had to vote based on a percentage, and that meant that the third estate would have the least amount of votes, even though they had the most amount of people. So they got mad about that, and they ended up forming their own group called the National Assembly, and they met. They tried to meet in the stateroom, but Louis had it closed down before they could meet there. So they went out to the tennis courts and they formed a little constitution out there. And
Right.
Louis wasn't happy about that.
And what did they vow on the tennis court?
To get rid of the monarchy.
And to establish a constitution, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so who can tell me a little bit more about the National Assembly and what they stood for? And who were their leaders? You had a National Assembly?
I guess I did.
Okay.
The National Assembly, after they met on the tennis courts and they did that, actually the mayor of France was initiated in as the very first president of the National Assembly. Other clergy started to come in. Mayor of Paris, sorry. There you go.
France, same
France,
thing,
there
right?
you go. The clergy actually started to help them, and they started to gain momentum to get the Constitution written.
Okay. So they pass this, they start writing this constitution, and they come up with this thing called called the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And in that declaration, it declared liberty, property, and security for all. Well, Louis says, okay, I'll pass this Declaration of the Rights of Man. But at the same time, he's sending his forces, which are loyal to him, out into the streets as a way of martial law to keep the Third Assembly under control. So they're saying, no, this is not going to work. So they stormed the Bastille. And what were they looking for when they stormed the Bastille?
Well, a man had actually, one of the prisoners, because most of the prisoners who were in the Bastille were people of nobility. They were people that King Louis put in there. There were actually 7 prisoners in there, but one of the prisoners was saying that they were not going to feed them, or they were starving them. And so they were going to break in. Landry, who was running the Bastille at the time, said, no, we're not going to shoot you. When they had all these mobs come out, we're not going to shoot you. Look at our cannons. See, we don't even have anything in it. Don't worry about it. Well, since the cannons weren't loaded, they started climbing the walls. Somebody got one of the drawbridges down. When the drawbridge came down, they started to charge in. And then somebody else was trying to do the other one. Well, they started shooting. Well, finally, they lifted the white flag, surrendered. They took them as prisoners. They released the prisoners in.
And what happened to Landry?
Landry ultimately ended up, I think he ended up getting killed at the very end.
Landry was the first one to be beheaded. His head was carried around on a stake by the National Assembly, and the artillery in the Bastille was raided. So now this growing mob is now armed. So here we see a real pivotal point in history where this mob is just growing and growing in intensity and in feelings. And throughout all of these things that happened and all of these initiatives to restore prosperity in France and to bring food to the people had failed. So people were just growing more and more desperate. And I think we've all seen that throughout history. People grow more and more desperate, and as a last resort, they resort to violence. So this is where we're going to pick up the reading of The Tale of Two Cities. And so this kind of gives you an idea of what's going on and what our characters are dealing with. So from these things, are there any themes that stand out to you? Any themes? So let's go back to the storming of the Bastille. You had mentioned that the prisoners in the Bastille, how were they treated? And why were they there?
Most of them were there for...
Because they had spoken out against the king, or they had... Okay, so we're going to see...
Whether or not they had done whatever it was, if the king decided that they had, then he would put them there. So usually those people were nobility.
So the Bastille was kind of a picture of injustice during this time. So we see that theme kind of coming up out of this. All of these things that had taken place in 1789. The injustice of the people who were the peasants that had no food and they were given no rights. So are there any other themes that you can identify within these events? How about themes relating to what we're going through currently, in current times? Let's start with the Age of Enlightenment. Is there anything similar to that taking place current day?
The technology age.
Okay, technology?
Or information technology age.
Okay. What about the separation of church and state? That is continuing to play a role today. The church's place in society.
Not even that, just the National Assembly. Because they had 3 different areas. It's kind of like what we have now with presidential elections. Just because you're the popular vote does not necessarily mean that you're going to be the president.
And that you don't represent every class.
Well, it's the electoral votes.
Okay.
So that's very similar in that regard because the third had more delegates than the other ones, and then it was ultimately decided that each of them would get.
And there's a lot of talk going on right now about political like voting rights of different classes of people, correct? Okay, now somebody tell me about the effect of war and the economy. Anything like that going on today?
Well, we're still trying to get out of the Iraq and Afghanistan war.
And it left us in debt, okay?
Tremendous debts.
And are people questioning why we did that?
Yeah.
Okay, and how do you feel about that?
I mean, obviously I'm not in power and I can't make those decisions, but I think that we should have pulled out a long time ago. It would have saved us, I think, a lot of heartache, and I think a lot of us wouldn't be in the position that we're at.
And do you think those feelings divide people?
Of course.
Okay. So you can relate to how people may have felt then and now. Okay, let's talk about the Declaration of Rights of Man. Is this not the same as our Declaration of Independence?
Bill of Rights.
Okay. And what rights do we have?
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
All right. So do we not feel like we deserve the same rights as the French people thought they did? And would we fight for our rights if we didn't have them? Or have we fought for our rights?
Are we fighting our own nation for our rights? Because right now, what's happening in the news?
All right. Perfect.
Because
This is where I want you to go with this. This is why we're doing this, so you can really understand the turmoil that these people were under during this time. So continue. What were you
Just even in the news, they're talking about taking over and looking at people within our own country and spying on them. So what information is being stored about us? They're saying that any email that you send is currently being stored. They're building a national area and a storage area in Utah. How many of our citizens know about that? And how many of them are even looking at it, questioning it? What's happening with Google? What's happening with these other things where they're saying, yeah, go ahead and store this information for us, and how is the government planning on using it?
Well, those things kind of get masked by the royal baby. You know, people get more excited over the happier things instead of the sad things. I think people choose not to see what's really there.
I think something else with the Declaration of Rights is simply the Stand with Texas Women movement that's happening down in Austin with Wendy Davis. I mean, it's the rights of our bodies and the rights of our parts. And I think that, there's a lot of division from that.
Okay. Now, tell me about outside of the United States. Let's talk about Europe. Egypt. What just happened in Egypt?
They overthrew their government.
All right. Did they not do something similar to what they did at the storming of Versailles?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we see this theme of these people that have been oppressed and oppressed and oppressed, and then there's this tipping point. And when there's not a strong government in place, oftentimes it resorts to violence. So I think this gives us a pretty good understanding of where these people were at in their lives and what separated them and what they were up against. So I think from here, we'll be able to understand and see how Dickens develops our characters in A Tale of Two Cities.